There's a quiet kind of kindness that doesn't beg to be seen. It listens more than it speaks. It gives without keeping score. And when it walks away, it doesn't slam doors. It simply leaves a silence behind. If you were too kind for him, you probably wondered why it didn't save the relationship, why your patience, loyalty, and empathy weren't enough to make him stay, change, or choose you fully. Here's the truth most people learn too late. Your kindness didn't lose him, it marked him. And that's exactly why he can't forget you. You didn't love him because he had everything figured out. You didn't stay because he was always strong, confident, or consistent. You loved him in the spaces where he was still becoming. That's what made your kindness different. Most people offer love with invisible strings attached. They give affection when things are going well, when they feel secure, when they're getting something back that reassures them. But you didn't do that. You showed up when he was quiet, when he was uncertain, when his words didn't always match his actions. You didn't demand perfection from him before giving care. You didn't make him earn your empathy every single day. You saw the unfinished version of him and chose to stay present anyway. That kind of love is rare, and most people don't recognize it while they're receiving it, not because it isn't powerful, but because it's unfamiliar. For someone who has learned to protect themselves, unconditional kindness can feel confusing, almost unreal. It doesn't fit into the patterns they understand. You listened when he talked about his fears, even when he didn't know how to name them properly. You paid attention to the pauses in his sentences, to what he avoided saying. You gave him space to be flawed without making him feel small for it. You didn't weaponize his weaknesses later. You didn't store them away for an argument. You treated his vulnerability like something sacred. And that leaves a mark. Psychologists have a term for this kind of experience: unconditional positive regard. It's the feeling of being accepted without judgment, without performance, without fear of being rejected for who you are in that moment. Studies show that when people experience this kind of acceptance, it creates a deep emotional imprint. The brain doesn't forget it easily because it feels like safety, like relief, like rest. You were that for him. Even if he didn't know how to say it, even if he didn't know how to protect it. Think about how many people go through relationships constantly bracing themselves, watching what they say, hiding parts of themselves, pretending to be stronger, cooler, less emotional than they really are. Now imagine what it feels like to be around someone who doesn't require the mask, someone who doesn't punish honesty, someone who doesn't leave the moment things get uncomfortable. That was you. You didn't rush him when he needed time. You didn't mock him when he doubted himself. You didn't turn love into a transaction. You weren't keeping score, waiting to cash in later. You gave because it was who you were, not because you expected immediate repayment. And here's the part most people don't understand: unconditional love doesn't always inspire gratitude right away. Sometimes it exposes insecurity instead. When someone receives a level of kindness they don't believe they deserve, it creates internal conflict. They start to wonder why you see something in them they can't see in themselves, and instead of rising to meet it, they pull away. Not because your kindness was too much, but because it was too honest. Real life is full of stories like this. People often look back years later and realize the person who loved them during their most uncertain phase was the one who understood them the deepest. You'll hear it in the way they talk about it: slower, quieter, with a trace of regret. She believed in me before I believed in myself. He stayed when I didn't know where I was going. Those memories don't disappear. They become emotional reference points. You became his reference point. Long after the relationship ended, after life moved on and new faces appeared, that memory stayed. Because not every relationship offers kindness without conditions. Not every person creates a space where someone feels accepted without having to prove their worth. You did that naturally. You didn't try to fix him. You didn't position yourself above him. You didn't love him from a place of ego. You met him where he was and said, without saying it out loud. You don't have to be more than this right now. That's powerful. And here's why he can't forget it. The nervous system remembers safety. The mind may rationalize, rewrite history, or pretend it didn't matter, but the body remembers how it felt to be at ease, to not be on guard, to not feel measured or evaluated. When he encounters conflict later, when love feels conditional, when affection comes with pressure or expectation, something inside him compares it. Not consciously at first, just a quiet sense that something is missing. That missing thing is you. Your kindness wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't demand recognition, but it softened his internal world in ways he didn't fully notice until it was gone. While you were there, it felt normal, like air, and like air, its absence is only felt once it's no longer there. You didn't ask him to change to earn your care. You didn't threaten to leave every time things got hard. You gave him the gift of being loved without fear. And for someone who has spent their life bracing for disappointment, that kind of experience stays with them. Even if they walk away, even if they don't know how to protect it, even if they weren't ready to meet it. You were too kind for him, not because kindness is a flaw, but because it requires maturity to receive it fully. It takes emotional awareness to understand that unconditional love isn't something you test, neglect, or take for granted. And when someone realizes, often much later, that they were loved without conditions, the weight of that realization settles slowly. It shows up in quiet moments, in comparisons they don't talk about, in memories that surface when they least expect it. You weren't just someone who loved him. You were someone who showed him what love could feel like without fear. That doesn't fade. That doesn't get replaced easily. And even if he never says your name again, even if your paths never cross, the part of him that was seen without judgment remembers you. Because unconditional kindness doesn't scream for attention, it echoes. You didn't demand anything from him the moment he walked into the room. You didn't size him up, test him, or wait for him to prove his worth before you softened. You simply existed in a way that made it easier for him to breathe, and in a world that taught him to armor up, that mattered more than you may ever realize. From an early age, many people learn that vulnerability is dangerous, that showing emotion invites judgment, that admitting fear, confusion, or doubt makes them less respected, less valued, less safe. So they build layers. They learn how to joke instead of confess, how to distract instead of feel, how to stay busy so they don't have to sit with what hurts. By the time he met you, that armor wasn't something he consciously wore. It was just part of him, automatic, instinctive, a survival response shaped by years of needing to appear fine even when he wasn't. And then you showed up, not trying to tear the armor off, not trying to expose him, but offering a space where he didn't have to keep it on all the time. You didn't interrogate his silence. You didn't punish his hesitation. You didn't turn his guardedness into an accusation. You understood that safety isn't created through pressure. It's created through patience. So when he struggled to explain what he was feeling, you didn't rush him. You let the pauses exist. You stayed present without filling every quiet moment with demands. You listened not just to what he said, but to what he avoided, to what lingered behind his words. And slowly, without even realizing it, he began to relax around you. That's not accidental. Neuroscience tells us that the nervous system is constantly scanning for safety or threat. When someone feels judged, rushed, or misunderstood, their body stays in a state of defense. But when someone feels accepted and unthreatened, the body shifts, breathing slows, muscles soften, walls come down, not because they're forced, but because they're no longer needed. You were that signal of safety. Around you, he didn't have to perform strength. He didn't have to pretend he had answers. He could admit he didn't know what he wanted yet. He could say he was tired. He could reveal the cracks without fearing they'd be used against him later. And that kind of emotional safety is rare. Most people want vulnerability, but few know how to hold it. They ask for honesty, then recoil when it's messy. They say, open up, then judge what comes out. You didn't do that. You didn't flinch when he showed uncertainty. You didn't shame him for being human. You made it clear, without saying it directly, that he was allowed to be unfinished in your presence. But here's the hard truth most people don't talk about. Safety can feel terrifying to someone who has lived in survival mode for too long. When someone has learned to navigate chaos, peace feels unfamiliar. When they've adapted to instability, calm can feel unsettling. Because safety removes distractions, it removes excuses. It forces a person to sit with themselves. And sometimes that's the scariest part. You didn't just offer comfort. You offered reflection. In your presence, he could no longer blame the noise of the world for his internal unrest. There were no fires to put out, no battles to fight, no masks to hide behind. Just quiet understanding. And that quiet showed him parts of himself he wasn't ready to face. This is why people sometimes pull away from the very person who makes them feel safest. Not because the safety isn't wanted, but because it exposes unresolved wounds. Being seen without armor means confronting the parts of yourself you've been protecting for years. You didn't trigger his fear, you revealed it. And that revelation lingers. Even after you were gone, his body remembered how it felt around you. The way conversations flowed without tension. The way he didn't have to watch his words so closely. The way silence didn't feel like rejection, but like understanding. Research on attachment shows that once someone experiences a secure emotional bond, even briefly, it changes their internal expectations. They may return to old patterns, but something inside them knows there is another way to exist. Another way to be loved. You gave him that experience. And here's the part that stays with him the longest. You never demanded that he expose himself. You never forced intimacy. You allowed it to arrive naturally. That respect made the safety real. You didn't try to rescue him. You didn't frame yourself as his savior. You stood beside him, steady and grounded, and let him decide when to step closer. That's why your absence feels so loud now. Without you, the world goes back to asking him to harden, to toughen up, to keep things moving, to not dwell, and maybe he can do that. Maybe he's done it his whole life. But now he knows what it feels like to not have to. He knows what it's like to sit across from someone and not feel evaluated. To speak without rehearsing. To exist without bracing. That knowledge doesn't disappear. It shows up in quiet moments. Late nights, when conversations feel shallow. When vulnerability is met with impatience instead of care. Something in him tightens, and he doesn't always know why. That's your imprint. You didn't just offer love. You offered a nervous system reset. A moment where his body learned that connection doesn't have to hurt. And even if he wasn't ready to stay in that space, even if he stepped back into his armor, the memory of safety remains. Because once someone experiences peace without pressure, they carry the echo of it with them. You didn't weaken him by offering safety. You showed him what strength could feel like without defense. And that kind of knowing changes a person, whether they admit it or not. You didn't love him with a checklist in your hand. You didn't keep track of who gave more, who texted first, who tried harder on which day. You weren't measuring the relationship like a transaction. You showed up because it felt right to show up. In a world where so much affection is conditional, that alone set you apart. Most people learn, consciously or not, that love comes with rules. You do this for me, I'll do that for you. You prove your worth, I'll stay. You meet my expectations, I'll keep giving. Even when it's unspoken, that mindset shapes how people connect. You didn't play that game. You gave time without asking for constant reassurance. You offered understanding without demanding immediate change. You supported him without turning that support into leverage later. When he struggled, you didn't say, "After all I've done for you." You didn't turn your generosity into a reminder of his shortcomings. And because of that, something subtle but powerful happened inside him. Psychologists talk about internal standards, the quiet benchmarks we use to judge experiences, relationships, and ourselves. These standards are shaped not by what people say, but by what they consistently experience. When someone receives care without pressure, it slowly rewires what they come to expect from connection. You raised his internal standard without ever announcing it. At first, he may not have noticed. When kindness is freely given, it can feel like background noise, like something that's always been there. But the mind absorbs patterns even when the ego doesn't acknowledge them. Your consistency taught him, on a level deeper than thought, that love doesn't always demand proof of worth. You didn't punish him for having off days. You didn't withdraw affection every time he disappointed you. You allowed room for growth instead of insisting on perfection. That generosity became part of his emotional environment. And environments shape people. Think about how quickly people notice the absence of warmth when they leave a safe home. At first, they might feel free, unrestrained. But eventually, they realize something is missing, not because the new place is bad, but because they've been calibrated to a higher level of care. That's what you did. By giving without demanding, you changed what felt normal to him. You made decency, patience, and emotional generosity part of the baseline. Even if he didn't consciously appreciate it while he had it, his nervous system learned it. Behavioral studies show that humans adapt rapidly to consistent kindness. Once that kindness is removed, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. What once felt ordinary now feels rare. That's why later in other connections, something feels off to him. Conversations may be louder, expectations heavier, affection more conditional, and without knowing exactly why, he feels the difference. You're the difference. You didn't ask him to earn your care every single day. You didn't turn love into a reward system. You trusted that your giving didn't need immediate repayment to be valid. And that trust is disarming to someone who has learned to equate love with effort and exhaustion. But here's the part many people miss. Giving without demanding doesn't mean lacking boundaries. It means choosing generosity from strength, not from fear. You weren't begging him to stay. You weren't shrinking yourself to be accepted. You were simply being yourself, open, steady, present. That authenticity sets a quiet standard that lingers. Even if he walked away, even if he couldn't meet you where you stood, he carries that internal shift with him. He may not articulate it. He may not even realize it consciously. But when he encounters relationships built on pressure, comparison, or emotional bargaining, something in him resists. Because now he knows there is another way. You showed him that love can be offered without manipulation. That care doesn't have to come with constant evaluation. That someone can give freely and still remain whole. That lesson doesn't disappear just because the relationship ends. Real life offers countless examples of this. People often leave relationships believing they'll find something easier, lighter, less demanding. And at first, they might, but eventually, they notice that the ease came at the cost of depth, or that the freedom came with emotional emptiness, or that the attention they receive now must be constantly earned. That's when memory sharpens. They remember the person who gave without tallying, the one who didn't keep score, the one who offered support without turning it into a debt. That person becomes the quiet benchmark. You became the standard by simply being consistent, by showing up in ways that didn't demand applause, by offering care that wasn't strategic, by loving without needing to control the outcome. And that's why your absence is so educational. Without you, he encounters relationships that reveal what you never did: conditions, expectations, emotional invoices. And each time the comparison happens, not as a dramatic realization, but as a subtle discomfort. Something feels heavier now. Something feels less safe. Something feels less generous. And even if he doesn't trace that feeling back to you directly, the standard remains. You recalibrated his understanding of what love can look like. You didn't need to announce your value. You didn't need to demand recognition. You changed him quietly through consistency and care. Giving without demanding doesn't make you forgettable. It makes you foundational. Because people may forget what they argued about. They may forget specific moments, but they don't forget how a relationship made them feel about themselves. and you made him feel worthy without conditions. That becomes the measure, whether he wants it to or not. When you were there, nothing about it felt dramatic. There were no grand announcements about your impact, no warning signs telling him what your presence was quietly holding together. That's how real presence works. It blends into life so smoothly that it feels like part of the air, steady, invisible, essential. While you were beside him, you absorbed more than you should have had to. You softened moments that could have turned sharp. You listened when he was restless. You steadied conversations when emotions ran high. You brought patience into situations that might have otherwise collapsed into conflict or silence. And because you did it without complaining, without reminding him, without asking for credit, he didn't always notice. Not because it didn't matter, but because it worked. You were regulating the emotional temperature of the relationship without ever naming it. Studies in psychology show that in close connections, one emotionally grounded person often becomes the stabilizing force for both. When that person leaves, the system feels the imbalance immediately, not logically, viscerally. Your presence was doing work he never saw. You were the pause before reactions, the calm after stress, the understanding when things didn't make sense. While you were there, misunderstandings didn't spiral as far. Silence didn't feel as threatening. Tension didn't linger as long. You had a way of bringing things back to center, even when neither of you fully realized it. So when you left or when you emotionally stepped back, the difference wasn't immediate fireworks. It was quieter than that. At first, things just felt off. Conversations didn't land the same way. Misunderstandings stretched longer. The emotional air felt heavier. And that's when realization begins, not as clarity, but as discomfort. He might have thought he felt relief at first. Less accountability, less reflection, less emotional depth to navigate. That can feel easier in the short term, but ease without grounding quickly turns into emptiness. Because what he lost wasn't noise. He lost balance. Research on attachment and loss shows that people often don't miss the person right away. They miss the way life felt around them. The rhythm, the emotional steadiness, the sense of being anchored. That's why absence teaches lessons presence never could. Your absence stripped away the buffer. Suddenly, when something went wrong, there was no one translating emotions into understanding. No one holding space instead of escalating. No one reminding him gently that not everything needed to be defended or avoided. And that's when memory sharpens. He starts to notice how often things fall apart now. How quickly frustration rises. How silence feels colder instead of safe. How misunderstandings don't resolve themselves. And slowly, the truth surfaces. You weren't just there. You were holding something together. You were the difference between chaos and calm. And he didn't see it because you made it look effortless. People often mistake emotional labor for personality. They think that's just how she is. They don't realize it's effort, awareness, choice, care. And when that care disappears, the gap becomes undeniable. Your absence forces comparison, not immediately to you, but to what replaced you. And that's when it hits him. Other connections require more energy, but offer less peace. Conversations feel louder, but less meaningful. Conflicts feel sharper. There's less room for mistakes, less grace, less quiet understanding. That contrast is brutal. You didn't need to tell him what you contributed. You didn't need to explain your value. Your absence does that now, every single day. It teaches him what your presence was buffering, what your patience was absorbing, what your kindness was preventing. Lost studies show that humans often only understand the function of something once it's gone. Not the sentiment, the function. And your function wasn't just emotional closeness. It was regulation, stability, perspective. You grounded him in ways he didn't recognize until the ground disappeared. That's why thoughts of you surface unexpectedly. Not always with longing, sometimes with confusion. A quiet question he doesn't know how to answer. Why does everything feel harder now? Because the person who made it feel lighter is no longer there. You didn't just fill space, you shaped it. And when you leave a space you shaped with care, The emptiness isn't neutral, it's noticeable. He may replay moments differently now. Conversations he once dismissed. Times you chose understanding over reaction. Moments you stayed calm when he wasn't. Those memories shift, not because they changed, but because he finally sees their weight. Your absence teaches him what your presence spared him from. It shows him how much emotional effort you quietly contributed, how much stability you offered without asking for recognition, how often you chose peace over ego. And that lesson doesn't fade quickly. Even if he moves on, even if life fills with new people, even if he tries to outrun the comparison, the imprint remains. Because you didn't make life louder, you made it steadier. And once someone experiences that kind of presence, its absence is unmistakable. You never had to announce your value. You never had to demand appreciation. Your absence speaks now, and it tells the truth you never needed to say out loud. You didn't leave in anger. You didn't burn bridges or try to prove a point. You didn't turn your pain into bitterness. You grew. And growth has a sound most people don't expect. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue or explain. It simply moves forward, and in doing so, it leaves echoes behind. While you were with him, you were learning, sometimes the hard way, what it meant to choose yourself without abandoning your kindness. You were paying attention to what felt heavy and what felt nourishing. You were noticing how often you made space and how rarely it was returned. You didn't shame him for it. You didn't demand he become someone else overnight. You just started listening to yourself. That's where growth begins, quietly. At first, it probably looked like small changes. You stopped over-explaining your feelings. You paused before rushing in to fix things that weren't yours to fix. You began honoring your energy instead of draining it to keep the peace. These weren't dramatic acts. They were subtle shifts in self-respect. And those shifts changed the entire dynamic. You didn't announce boundaries with ultimatums. You embodied them. You didn't threaten to leave. You simply became less available to situations that asked you to shrink. That kind of growth is unsettling to someone who benefited from your emotional overfunctioning. Because when one person grows, the imbalance becomes visible. You weren't becoming cold. You weren't becoming distant. You were becoming aligned. You started choosing honesty over harmony. You chose clarity over confusion. You chose yourself without needing to punish anyone else for it. And that's where the echo begins. Research in personal development and relationship psychology shows that people are most impacted not by those who leave loudly, but by those who leave stronger. When someone exits a dynamic with dignity, emotional regulation, and visible self-respect, it creates cognitive dissonance in the other person. They can't dismiss you as too much or too emotional. They're left facing the uncomfortable truth that you simply outgrew the container they were offering. That realization lingers. You didn't collapse when things ended. You didn't beg to be chosen. You didn't spiral publicly or rewrite yourself to stay palatable. You carried your grief quietly and kept moving forward. You continued becoming. That's haunting in the most honest way, because growth doesn't just change you, it changes the story he tells himself. He can't easily label you as the problem when you didn't become smaller or harder. You became clearer, calmer, more grounded. You didn't harden your heart. You strengthened your spine, and that version of you, the one who walked away with integrity, is the one that stays with him. He remembers the way you stopped arguing and started listening to yourself. The way you no longer chased resolution at the cost of your peace. The way you chose silence over explanation when you realized you were being misunderstood on purpose. Those moments replay, not as regret necessarily, but as recognition. You became someone he could no longer access, not because you punished him, but because you changed. Studies on relationship reflection show that people often think about the partner who grew beyond them more than the one who left angrily. Growth creates an unresolved question. What if I had met them where they were going? And that question doesn't fade easily. You didn't leave him behind, you moved ahead. And when someone stays still while another evolves, the distance becomes impossible to ignore. You became proof of what happens when kindness meets self-respect. You didn't abandon your softness. You refined it. You learned where to place it. You stopped offering it to situations that couldn't hold it. That's not rejection, that's discernment, and discernment changes how people remember you. He may see parts of you now that he didn't appreciate before. Your emotional intelligence, your patience, your depth. Not because you suddenly became those things, but because he finally has the distance to see what was in front of him all along. Growth creates contrast, and contrast creates echoes. Every time he encounters someone who demands without giving, he remembers your balance. Every time communication feels shallow, he remembers your depth. Every time connection feels rushed or performative, he remembers your presence. Not because you were perfect, but because you were evolving. You didn't try to prove your worth after you left. You didn't narrate your healing, you lived it. And that quiet confidence is unforgettable. People don't always miss the person. Sometimes they miss the version of themselves they were around that person. And around you, he had access to something better, more grounded, more honest, more human. Your growth reflected what was possible. And even if he wasn't ready to grow with you, the echo of who you became stays with him. Because growth doesn't chase, it doesn't convince, it doesn't look back for validation. It simply continues. And when someone witnesses that kind of evolution up close, when they see kindness paired with boundaries, compassion paired with self-respect, it changes them whether they want it to or not. You didn't disappear, you transformed, and transformations don't get forgotten. Being too kind didn't make you weak, it made you rare. He may move on, he may smile, he may pretend it didn't matter, but somewhere, quietly, you remain. Not as pain, not as regret, but as the memory of a love he wasn't ready for. And the truth is, people don't forget the ones who love them purely. They forget names, they forget faces, but they never forget how it felt to be seen and to lose it.